back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Hawley, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show, and thank you again for the patience in setting up this meeting. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hello, yes, I'm Michael Hawley, and then I do research with the Jack the Ripper case, the Whitechapel murder mystery. And my primary research is with one of the suspects called Francis Tumblety, who's buried in Rochester, New York.
You have been doing this for a while. You've been looking into Tumblety. You've been talking about Jack the Ripper. You've done many conferences. We talked about this off air. You've done many podcasts and other things, and really spoke about Tumblety. What do you think is so fascinating about the Jack the Ripper case? Was it because it doesn't have an end to it? Because obviously everyone has their own theories, but it's like the JFK assassination for me. It's just like there's just you're always researching, you're always doing something, and you think you're over with it, and the next thing you know, you uncover something else.
Yes, and it'll stay a mystery because it's part of history. Even though you get everyone saying, "Oh, I have found out this suspect, 100% convinced, absolute," and then but it won't be. Even with the supposed DNA evidence, which is actually incorrect. The It's as I said, it's kind of part of history. But what's happening is in my case, I'm discovering a lot more that we need to put into the Jack the Ripper lexicon so you can get a bigger picture understanding. And even though, let's say, earlier arguments of even with Jack the Ripper sound convincing, but if you don't have the correct evidence, then it's not it might be a valid argument, but it won't be a sound argument. Sound argument is when you have all the evidence and then see if it fits the picture. So that's why I enjoy being part of that, adding more to the Ripper story with evidence. And you were talking about this, and that's evidence based is really important. Although, let's say, for example, now I have a little bias because I'm a human, bias towards, let's say, Tumblety. That's why I invite anyone to look at the evidence with me and then see the other side. And that only helps to find the truth, closer to the truth. And then so I love that part of the story.
I'm going to ask about the Tumblety evidence, or just a like, brief recap for anybody out there listening who didn't catch your first episode. You can go back and listen to your first episode. But obviously, if you're following like a good basis of a record, would be looking at the police records, or just looking at anything that we have that was already in an investigation that might have been a little bit done, or just any information from back then that might have been logged by a police officer because they have credit to them. They're police officers. Um, but then again, you get your whole different thing of theories if people don't trust the police and they go, I'm not trusting any of their investigation because their investigation is this. I'm going to go look over here in a completely different area. And then you'll come across a whole swath of different things.
Yes, right. Yeah, so like with the Tumblety case, they're actually on the calendar court records, Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey, they used to call it. You could see that Tumblety was received into custody on November 7th, 1888, and it was for a misdemeanor charge of gross indecency and indecent assault. And then what happened was in the court records, you see that the plus the records of the NVA, which was that worked for prosecuting minor cases. They were prosecuting the Tumblety case, and they showed that on November. So when you first get arrested, you go in front of the police court magistrate, and that's called a remand hearing, to see if we're going to remand this person in Holloway prison until we have the committal hearing, which is a week later, to see if it's going to be committed up to the judge. And so at the remand hearing is where you uh, basically, if you get arrested, you have to get it into the courts, and that's what the police court magistrate is. So it's a magistrate. It's the courts that make the decision to allow you to be jailed or not. And the British were really it was important in the late 19th century that you're not putting somebody in jail without being convicted. So the writ of habeas corpus, that was important to them. So when you were arrested, within 24 hours, you had to be in front of a police court magistrate. And Tumblety was. So he was received into custody on November 7th. And then he would have been in front of that magistrate. We don't have any records because those files are closed. And then that's a longer discussion too. But he would have been in front of that magistrate and then been allowed post bail. And then Tumblety always had he had thousands of dollars on him and lots of jewelry on him at all times. So what happened is we have record in the police in the court calendar that he was rearrested or received it back into custody on November 16th for the committal hearing. So that meant he was out on the street at that time, and November 9th was the last Ripper murder. But then what happened was is we know that he posted bail from the uh, the committal hearing. So the November 14th was a committal hearing. November 16th, he posted bail, was out on the street. November 18th was his grand jury, the grand jury on his case, which he received a true bill, which meant that it's going to the judge. They agree with the magistrate. It's got to go to the judge. November 19th is when we see record of Tumblety taking money out of his New York City bank. and so it was supposed to have been in front of the judge on the 19th or 20th. And the Tumbley's lawyer was in front of the judge without Tumblety. Tumblety wasn't there, but got that court to postpone his case until December 10th. But Scotland Yard found Tumblety in France on November 23rd. So he sneaked out of the country. And then they assumed that he came back to America. And so when on December 2nd was when that ship came into the New York City harbor, and there's two New York City police detectives waiting for him that knew Tumblety by sight. And there was a Scotland Yard detective there too, but they didn't have him on anything. And it was because it was a misdemeanor charge that he was on, they could not arrest him and indict him back. Or so he he got into a cab and sneaked off to 79 East 10th Street. And so that Scotland Yard detective followed him there. And so that kind of was the process. So, but the court wasn't until December 10th that it was in front of the judge, and that they realized that he absconded. He sneaked out. And so at December 10th is when they filed, what is that called? Where, try to arrest him, but they couldn't because he was in America already. So then the case was basically dropped because he was back into America. But what we found out is December 9th when a Walters is a police constable, actually first class detective, came to Canada for a different reason, but he got orders to come to America to find the murderer, is what the report said. But so he came to America, and there's a long story with that, but it was basically for the Tumblety case, and that's what we were discussing last time.
Now, he could have been extradited from Canada? I think you mentioned. Is there a reason, like specifically, he just fled to America because they weren't going to extradite him back to the UK? Is that why he went there? Or did he have family or somebody located over there?
In America?
Yeah, like why would he go to America when he could just go to Canada or go anywhere else that could be farther away? I would think your first guess would be America.
He could go to Canada, but in Canada, because they were still part of the United Kingdom in a way, meaning legally that they could have extradited him back. He considered himself a resident of New York City at that time. So, and sometimes Brooklyn, even though some of the family was in Rochester, New York, and even though he owned land in west 3,000 acres near Canada, but it was mostly forested land. So, but he came back to America because that's basically where he was from. So he would stay in the United States for most of the year from in the 1870s and early 1880s, and then in the summertime is when he would go to London or England or Europe. But he would always come back to the United States because he was always making a trek. He would always go to Hot Springs, Arkansas, the Mecca for syphilis patients. But he would always take the train. But it was the United States that he was mostly in. So I could see him why he would come back to America, and especially the fact that he can't get extradited back because of the misdemeanor charge.
I think you also mentioned on your last episode that there was also killings that you could track or be able to pinpoint as that being further killings of Jack the Ripper associated killings.
Oh yeah, and that was my latest book. And that was the question: is if he truly was a serial killer when he came back to America, were there any Ripper-like murders in America? And that's when I said. So I decided to look, and Tumblety was a hermaphrodite, as what they used to call. He had no working penis, so he couldn't rape. Most women on the street back then were both raped and murdered, sadly, and they called it outrage. They didn't like to use the word rape in the paper, so they call it outraged. And so I started finding around 1880. I looked in the 1870s, 1880, these women that were murdered on the street, and they called them mysterious murders because they were neither raped nor robbed. They had their jewelry still on them. And they were, and then they were always near railroad tracks or train stations. And and there's a clusters of them in around. And what I noticed was is Tumbledy's annual train track matched this, and there were 39 unsolved murders, unsolved. And if you go on Google and Google these women's names, you don't find them. They're buried to history. So you'd see the murder, it would make the papers, and then sadly, they lynched somebody or before there was even a court thing. I mean, there was some nasty things that went on back then, but I would follow the case until let's say somebody was, they charged it with somebody and he was found not guilty. And then, but then next thing you know, I find Tumblety either in town or the reporter thought it was Tumblety. And so here's this. So not only 39 murders, there was 37 attempted murders and some interesting assaults. And the interesting things about them is that there's usually a physical description the person can give. And it was a tall man, a thick mustache, ulster coat in so many cases. And Tumblety, when he came back to America on December 2nd after the Ripper murders, was wearing an ulster coat, as the reporter said. And he was 6 foot tall. And then so that was tall, especially back then. And then he had a thick mustache. And so when he came back to America, here it is. It was December 2nd when he came back to America. And then the papers on December 4th said that there was a Scotland Yard detective outside his window. And surprise, surprise, Tumblety vanished from New York City on December 5th. Well, I found out where he went. He went to Waterloo, New York, because I knew that his sister lived there. And a cool thing about these newspapers, old newspapers, they're being archived, digitized, and Waterloo digitized their newspapers. This is a local newspaper, yeah, on newspapers.com. I think that's the one I was using. And it says, hey, Tumblety's in town. And they knew it was Tumblety because Tumblety was there about 8 years earlier, 7 or 8 years earlier, when Tumblety was arrested in Toronto for sodomy. And so he sneaked to Waterloo. So under sworn testimony, the nephew, Thomas Powderly, who was from Waterloo, this was a 1905 court case, admitted that yeah, Tumblety would come to their town. It came to them, came to Waterloo when he was hiding from Toronto. So he would use that place to hide out because it's a small town. Well, surprise, surprise, that evening, a woman was accosted on the street by a tall man, grabbed her by the throat and knocked her down to the ground. And this, by the way, the Ripper murders, they were choked first. Their tongues were out, and you could see that they were choked first. And then the reporter, it was the same article, was convinced it was Tumblety. And then, Tumblety vanished from that spot. So 1 week later in Chicago, right along the train tracks, this woman was in a cable car, saw this tall man, thick mustache, ulster coat, sitting across the car from her, the seat from her. She gets out at nighttime and waiting for the next one. And then he got out. So the car didn't come. So she started walking down the tracks, and that man grabbed her by the throat and then said, obey me or I'm going to kill you, kind of thing. And he pulled out a gun, and we know Tumblety used to carry a gun. And then so she screamed, and she saw some train workers this way, so she screamed and started running towards them. She said it was a tall man in a gray ulster coat. And what do you know? I find an article. Tumblety's supposed to be in Chicago. So it's like I get all this stuff. So uh, so what I did was I traced all those murders and assaults, and I call them a real. I'm convinced I found at least one serial killer, maybe two. And then, how surprise, surprise, here's a Jack the Ripper suspect in town, or I can't eliminate him, or he's right along that train track. And some of the stories that I talk about, it'll be quite intriguing when you hear those, or if that's what we talked about before. So yeah, so that's what I brought to this, the table with all the Ripper stuff. Is like, and when you look at the first murder, that's the canonical five, and that's kind of what we might be talking about too, is Polly Nichols. You could see that killer was already experienced. I mean, here it is with that murder site. We have Walter Perkins. He was awake across the street, heard nothing. The Green family were two houses down, heard nothing. And then there was another guard, heard and saw nothing of that murder. And that's what we see with all these Ripper murders. Is the next one, Annie Chapman. The people at 29 Hambury Street heard and saw nothing. And then with Elizabeth Stride, there was a lady just a couple blocks sitting outside looking at the street, and the murder was happening to her left. She heard and saw nothing. So then Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, same thing, is the people in Mitre Square were awake and heard and saw nothing. And it's like you could see, like, when in the words of uh, Ian Fleming, with James Bond, he said with Goldfinger, when Goldfinger said to James Bond, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, but three times is enemy action, because he saw James Bond for a third time. Here's this killer, four times in a row was absolute silence. That is so much the MO of this killer. And so he was silent. And then, but nobody really talks about this part, is where, when you think about it, the reason why it's still unsolved. And this is what really intrigues me about the Jack the Ripper case you asked about, is that I could see this killer wanting to do his business, and I think it's organs, but still it's killing. That if he meets up with an unfortunate, and remember I said that the police, if they caught any man with an unfortunate, they would arrest him. So, and he's got a long knife on him. Yeah, and so he would wait till nobody was around. There were no eyewitnesses, and then go in and then watch the police constable leave that beat. And so they know that they had 15 minutes or a half hour at that spot, do his business and leave. So, but if, let's say, for example, you're Jack the Ripper, you're with an unfortunate, and there's two people walk by, I can see him abandoning that one. So we don't know how many times that Jack the Ripper abandoned in situations, because there was somebody that saw him, so they just left, so nobody would know that would have been Jack the Ripper. So I think what we're seeing as these absolute mysterious murders, that again, these women were not raped either, that so it shows to me this, that Jack the Ripper was just so cunning, and then invisibility was his thing. So there were no eyewitnesses. And really, there were no eyewitnesses. Even everybody has to admit, nobody saw the murders. So now, and a lot of other people say, well, somebody saw him possibly with somebody. My point is it doesn't fit his MO of being absolutely silent. So that's why, to me, is what is so intriguing. Now, what's intriguing about Tumblety is that he was just an intriguing character. I mean, this guy was so bizarre. He was even suspected in the Lincoln assassination, because he loved the theater, and I found him in Buffalo hanging out with John Wilkes Booth
Wait,
a few
what?
years before the Ripper murders.
That's crazy.
He's hanging out with John Wilkes Booth, and then so we know, because I'm from Buffalo, so we know where he was, where he's located. So I looked it up. John Wilkes Booth absolutely was in the performed in a play right there when Tumbley had an office, and so then that 1864. Like 1865 was the assassination. 1864 December, John Wilkes Booth and his two brothers performed in New York City. Well, Tumbley was there, so you could see why there was reasons why he was arrested. But I am convinced that he was not involved at all, because Tumbley was such a narcissist, could care less about that.
I know I had you on here to talk about some of the main suspects that I keep seeing it either in the forums or I get comments on the channel from old videos of Jack the Ripper stuff. But I wanted to ask you one more question here on Tumblety. Did you find anyone that was connected that was a male victim, or were they just strictly females?
No, so interestingly, surprise, surprise, I just found 2 weeks ago an article that this man said that he remembered Tumblety in Detroit and he tried to kill a young man. And it's like, how interesting is that? He tried to kill this young man. And that was what the report, the interview, it was an article said that somebody tried to kill this young man. Well, what I found was, and it's a really cool case, is now Tumbley had this obsession for gold watches. And so in court cases where someone would come into his herb doctor office, he'd charge this much money and your gold watch. So yeah, he loved gold watches. So and that even in 1891 when he was robbed in Hot Springs, they took one of his gold watches, and that was in the papers. But here's this man, and now I forgot. Uh, um, it's in my book, but it's I think a few years after the murders, this young man was going to get married to this woman, and he was kind of nervous because when he was at the young lady's house, she said that this tall man was bothering him on the streets, and that's what Tumblety would do. He would and because his taste was for young men, so he said this guy's following him, and he thinks the guy is a robber. So, and the danger for that man was that man had all of his money in his pocket because he was about to get married to this woman, and so that they were going to, get married, and then they were going to buy a home with this money. So he was worried, and he had to go. He had to leave and go back home, and he knew he was going to encounter that tall guy again. So he brought a gun. So he told his wife to be that, oh, next time this guy shows up, so and that young man was found murdered the next day, shot. His gold watch was taken because he had a gold watch and a silver watch on him. The silver watch wasn't taken. The gold watch was taken, and he was murdered. And so it's to me, it's kind of interesting because that the wife said that he was saying a tall man was bothering him on the streets. And we have a couple of accounts, even in New Orleans, where he would approach a man, and then he basically want to kind of get involved with this young man, and then he got actually arrested twice in New York City. He The young man in that case said something to him, and then Tumbley hit him with a cane, and so Tumbley got arrested. So Tumbley, and then uh, so the answer is yes. And then there's actually another story about this where a woman was murdered, but one of the suspects was said a tall man with a thick mustache in New York City, um, followed him to that town in New Jersey, and it gave him. I think he thinks he drugged the guy drugged him because he said he was more drunk than he thought he was, but he remember that guy was dragging him around, this tall man, and that was a story. So there is a case, like a couple cases where, because Tumblety, I have a case where he was in around 1901 when one of his attorneys in Baltimore, Frank, he the attorney said that Tumblety was so upset that the attorney said he was afraid for his own safety because he thought Tumblety was going to, in the next second, jump at him. He wasn't even upset at the attorney. He was upset that someone dissed him somewhere at a restaurant. So he wanted to do a lawsuit against a restaurant or something. And so he was just so upset. So then that same attorney said about before that, there was only one telephone in that building at the time, and Tumbley was just kind of sitting on his bench. And this woman came for the attorney. That was the next person. And so the attorney says, "I'll be right back." And so just wait in my office. And of course, Tumbley's sitting there. then after the phone call, he comes back, and that woman is outside that office, just shaking. And he says, "Well, what's wrong?" He says, "That man in there. Don't ever let me in that room with that man." And he's going, "Well, tumbled. What did the guy do?" And he says, "He didn't really do anything. It's just what he did." So whatever he was doing, he did not treat that young woman very well. But that was around 1901. So I get all these court cases.
Tumblety, Kosminski, and then Charles Cross or Lechmere are like the three that I commonly see referenced all the time. I've spoken to two individuals who look at those two. I wanted to have you on to discuss some, not only about Tumblety, but also to discuss some of the Charles Lechmere and then also some of the Kosminski ones. So I was going to let you pick if you wanted to talk about either one of
Sure.
those guys
We'll
first. You just
we'll
mentioned
do
something.
We'll do Charles Cross first because that was the first of the canonical five murders, Polly Nichols. So the idea with Charles Cross was he was the first on the scene of the murder, and how that went about was PC Neal on his beat went into Bucks Row at 3:15, saw nothing. And then when he came around in Scotland Yard, police beats were 30 minutes, half hour. City of London were 15 minutes. But so Police Constable Neal was back there at 3:45 and found Polly Nichols murdered, throat cut. He shined his bullet lantern on her and saw the blood flowing. So that was at 3:45. PC Neal said. So then that made the papers that PC John Neal had discovered this body. And so what happened, that was August 31st. That was late at night, August 31st. So next thing you know, we find out that actually two others happened upon that body. And how that happened was apparently first it was Charles Cross, who they found out his real name was Lechmere, claimed at the coroner's inquest that he left work. It was at 22 Dovedon Street, which is in Bethnal Green, and he worked at 4 o'clock, and he worked all the way across at this place at Pickford. He was a carman, so he was basically he was a rider for those carts that you would put supplies in, and so that was his job on Broad Street. So that 22 Doveton, you could see he would go through like a shortcut, go through that Bucks Row to get to work. So work was at 4. So he said that he left at 3:30, and that was a little late for him at the time. And so he walked, and then when he went into Bucks Row, which would have been, it's a 7-minute walk. They calculated that. So about 8:37, he saw the body. So he was walking in the middle of the street. It was dark. He saw what he thought was a tarp, and then he's in the street. And then right when he saw that, and started realizing that that was a woman, then he heard footsteps, same direction he came from. It was Robert Paul, another carman. They didn't know each other. It was from a closer area, and that was Foster Street, 30 Foster Street. But he comes through that Bucks Road too to go to work. And so as Robert Paul's getting closer, then Charles Cross says, "Hey, look at this. There's someone laying there, a body." And so they both approached the body. And what they thought, well, Robert Paul said, was that it was either probably an unfortunate that it was too aggressive and then she's knocked out or she's drunk or maybe she's dead. But basically both of them knew that they were going to be late for work. So they decided that as they go to work, they're the first police constable they see, they're going to tell. And that's exactly what happened. As they left and walked west on Bucks Row, and they kept on going, and they hit what they call Baker's Road. They take a right. They saw PC Meisen doing knocking up duty. So he was waking people up. So that was his duty. And so it was Charles Cross who said, "Hey, there's a lady that's laying down. She's either dead or drunk in Bucks Row." And then he eventually left. So PC Meisen walked that direction. But in the meantime, PC Neal in his beat encountered the body, and nobody was around. And so when PC Neal saw that body, he said it was 3:45 when this happened. PC John Thane was on his duty on the other end of Bucks Row. And so Neil said, hey, go get the doctor, Dr. Llewellyn. And then that's when PC Meisen was coming this way. And so he said, you go get the ambulance, which was just a cart. And so that's what happened. And so all three police constables, PC Meisen said that those two Carmens, he says they didn't give a name, but he said he thought he was a Carmen. And then there was another person with him. And he said that was around 3:45 or quarter to four is what he said. And then when he interviewed John Thane said that PC Neal said it was when he was told to get the doctor was at 3:45. And these beat police were it's important to be at the right spot. So here's and in the coroner's inquest, it said that PC John Neal, they grilled him on his beat. So it was 3:15, nobody was at Bucks Row. 3:45, that's where he saw the body. So what happens is though, and then here's PC Charles Cross when he was interviewed said that he left. So about 3:30 he left, and so it was about 3:37, 3:40 when he saw the body. Well, and then Robert Paul said that he left around 3:45, and then came and down. So what happens is the outlier on the timing is Robert Paul. All the police officers and Charles Cross said it was 3:45 when PC Neal saw the body. So that meant that the two Carmen saw the body 5 minutes maybe before that. So 3:40. So that's kind of what happened. And so apparently the Lechmere theorists said what they're saying is that it wasn't Charles Cross that was the first one to see the body. It was actually it was Robert Paul saw Jack the Ripper in the act of killing. So Charles Cross is Jack the Ripper, and his real name is Lechmere. And so it's a fight or flight thing. So here it is. He's killing the woman, and here's Robert Paul coming on him that fast. So it was either I'm going to leave or I'm going to stay. And so they're claiming that he was such a narcissist that he said he's going to stay and then argue it out kind of thing and then and try to fake him. So what they're hinting at is when Robert Paul was going in Bucks Row, they claimed that Charles Cross was over the body. Of course, he's killing, so he backed off. And then so that's kind of the story of what they're saying. And so that what happened is that that was August 31st in the middle of the night. So August 31st happened then. That was in the morning. So 3-something in the morning. And so then that day, the newspaper started saying PC John Neal discovered another body. Well, at that time, Robert Paul is at work. And so you can see what happened is when he got done with work, he had to go home. So, of course, Bucks Row is on the way back home to Foster Street. So he encountered this Lloyd's Weekly reporter, and that he told the story that night. So that night he told the Lloyd's Weekly reporter that no, it was us two. We saw them. Me and this other guy. He didn't know the other guy's name, but we're the first ones that happened upon the scene, and it was exactly 3:45. Well, Lloyd's Weekly is a weekly newspaper that only is published on Sunday morning. Sunday, then they have a couple issues, but it's Sunday morning is the first one. So that report of Robert Paul hit the news on Sunday morning. So Friday was the murder. Saturday morning was the very first coroner's inquest. And at the inquest, everybody was convinced that PC Neal was the first on the scene. And then that's what happened. So, and that's the kind of the process. Well, then on Sunday morning in the paper, here is Robert Paul saying, we were the first on the scene. And when Robert Paul was walking down Bucks Row, he saw a man standing where the body was. And so the Lechmere guys are saying, Lechmere read that and said, uh-oh, they're going to think I'm Jack the Ripper. So he purposely, that was Sunday. Monday morning was the day 2 of the inquest. They're claiming that Charles Cross went to the inquest himself so he can say his side of the story and beat them at the punch kind of thing. And he wore his working outfit from work to fake his wife. And he used the name Cross instead of Lechmere so that if his wife saw the paper, she wouldn't connect the dots. So, and then that's why he claimed he was going to work. That's why he was in his work clothes. So that's kind of the conspiracy, is that here's Charles Cross came there on purpose. And then so my point is that, if you look at,
Well, can I just ask, does he have any type of insanity or anything when it comes to organs or some type of specific thing that we know is lined up with
nothing,
Jack the
we know
Ripper?
nothing.
Okay.
We know they know nothing either. They're trying to hint that because see he was working at Pickford as a carman. He got that job and he said he got it 20 years ago. And so he knows that back then he was actually living with his mother and his stepfather, or who was Thomas Cross, and he was a police officer at the time. So there must be some kind of thing that happened that messed him up or something. But there is no evidence of anything about the mother being bad, anything. There's no evidence whatsoever. So, so my point is that what really happened is that when on Saturday, everybody thought that PC John Neal was the first on the scene. The very first time the police and everybody were convinced that somebody else saw it was Sunday morning in the Lloyd's Weekly, when Robert Paul said, "I saw a man standing next to the body." So now they're claiming that Charles Cross read that, and then that's why he went into action. My point is at that moment, the police said, "Oh my gosh," anybody would say, Robert Paul saw somebody next to the body at the time of the murder. I mean, that was the time of the murder. Wouldn't anybody reading the paper, not just the Scotland Yard Police, City of London Police, everyone at Home Office, which is the boss of the Scotland Yard at Department of the Interior, everybody that reads the paper would think maybe that's Jack the Ripper. So here's Robert Paul, while he's reporting it, he's not at all convinced that that was the killer, because that, they're saying that Robert Paul's trying to get attention in the limelight. Well, wouldn't it be even better say, "Hey, I saw Jack the Ripper"? Well, so here it is. Everybody saw that, and as a matter of fact, what happened is in the Lloyd's Weekly on September 30th, Robert Paul was interviewed again, and he said that after that report, that statement he gave, he was fetched up in the middle of the night by the police. Well, you could see why. Well, if that's the case, if you're a detective or police, you want to get down to the bottom of it. The first person you're going to talk to is who's on that beat that was on Baker's Row, and they would have known it was PC Meisen. And so they would have interviewed PC Meisen to say what happened. And surprise, surprise, not surprise, that Monday morning at the coroner's inquest, they interviewed PC Meisen first that morning and asked about these people that claimed to have seen the body. And so he says, yeah, it was a carman, and there was another person, and he looked like a carman. So then PC Meisen said that he was on at that corner. There's and then right after that interview, late morning, they interviewed Charles Cross. And before they interviewed Charles Cross, they had Cross come in front of PC Meisen, and they said, "Is this the man that came to you that night?" And he says, "Yes." So I did an identification right there in the coroner's inquest. And so then, and again, Charles Cross is in his working clothes. My point is in the middle of the night on Sunday night, they found Robert Paul, and Robert Paul confirmed basically what happened. And so Paul didn't know, neither Paul nor Meisen knew who Charles Cross was, but they both of them said that he was a carman, or looked like a carman. And so that morning they could have just gone to these places like Pickford's, who hires a bunch of carmans, say, "Hey, anybody here see the body?" And if he would have, and it would have been him, he said, "Yeah." And so that's why he was in his working uniform, because they collected him from work Monday morning. And why his name is Charles Cross is that's the name he used, because here it is. He got the job at Pickford when his dad was a police officer, Thomas Cross. My point is at Pickford, they know him as Charles Cross. And so that's why his name is Charles Cross, is because that's the name he used. And then as opposed to Lechmere, yes, his real father, who wasn't raised by, was named Lechmere. And there are some official documents, of course, that say Lechmere. But I mean, if the man that raised you is Cross, I mean, my stepson, when he was younger, wanted to use my last name, but we didn't want that because I know we wanted to do it right. And then so I can see that happening. So and but so in this case is we have that point when that on that Lloyd's Weekly that Sunday that here's Robert Paul saying to everybody, I saw a man standing where the woman was. Wouldn't that make you think twice? I mean, thinking, oh, maybe he saw Jack the Ripper, and surprise, surprise, that's what Robert Paul said. Is the police then fetched him up in the middle of the night, and right after that. Now the Lechmere guys are saying that that happened, but it was after Monday. What they're trying to say is Robert Paul, or I mean, PC John Neal and the police, they rejected the idea, and they're claiming that no. Sunday night they were saying in an article that John Neal said, no, I was the man that found the body. So in their hubris, saying they didn't want the Carmen to be the first on the scene, that was me that did it. They kind of buried the story. But then once Charles Cross said he was on Monday, then they couldn't bear the story anymore. So that's when they fetched the Robert Paul up. But the way I see it is the most logical thing is this guy was just a Carmen going to work like he did every day, encountered a body. So here comes Robert Paul, encountered a body, and then they found Thane. Meisen there. Meisen came over. The problem is when Meisen was interviewed, he thought that those Carmen were told by PC John Neal, hey, fetch me another police officer. So Meisen actually thought, so the reason why nobody knew about these Carmen and why Meisen did not tell anybody about them, because he just thought they were just carriers of, just people that John Neal wanted to, hey, find some police officer and tell him to get his butt over here, kind of thing. And that's kind of how he explained himself, is that what this Charles Cross was, or this person was told, hey, there's a body. And it was Meisen that said he thought that it was PC John Neal that sent him, but it wasn't the case.
How difficult is it for you to find information on Charles Cross? Is it different because he uses two different last names? Like there's probably information on Cross and there's information on Lechmere probably.
There is when you look it up. They know it too. There's one case of Charles Cross, a Charles Cross. You don't know if it's the same Charles Cross, but a Charles Cross that was a Carmen in that area that actually accidentally hit some young person, and I think that person died. And then so that's the only event we see a Charles Cross as a Carmen. So it almost argues against this guy using the Lechmere name, but there's now official reports see that that they use the name Lechmere, but he also used the name Cross. So I would just say, go ahead. I mean, it's still a suspect, absolutely. I just think that if that person was the first on the scene, police would always suspect him. And why would the police not want to find Jack the Ripper? I mean, especially when Robert Paul said that guy was, standing where the woman was right during the time of the murders, right at that time. Of course, they're going to want to interview him. As a matter of fact, in 2.5 weeks later, there was a report, a police officer, a MIPO report, they called it, a Metropolitan Police Report to Home Office, that's who they report to, the Interior Ministry's Home Office. And on there, it laid out what happened. Charles Cross, it says, and they gave his address, 22 Dubden Street, and Robert Paul, 30 Foster Street, and they talked about how they met up with PC Meisen at, interestingly, the corner street that they used was different than what PC Meisen said at the coroner's inquest, meaning it was the same corner, but it was a three-way corner. So Hanbury Street, Old Montague Street, and then this Baker's Row. So it was Meisen at the coroner's inquest said Baker's Row and Hanbury Street, but then the report said Old Montague Street. So you could see that the police definitely interviewed Meisen to get exactly where it was, because that's how it was. The report was written. And so that was written just like that. And they used Charles Cross. And the thing is you can easily corroborate Charles Cross's story by going home to talk to the wife. And then so I think the Lechmere people said that they didn't know where he lived, but here's a report 2.5 weeks later saying Charles Cross of 22 Dubner Street. It was written right in the report. And then so just go to the wife, meaning this. What they're trying to say is Charles Cross or Lechmere didn't leave home at 3:30. He left home before that, and at 3:15, after PC John Neal left, he went in there with Polly Nichols at 3:15 and then murdered. And then so that would be easy to corroborate. Just contact the wife and ask the wife, you know, when did your husband leave? And remember, they're saying that Charles Cross wore his work clothes, the next day to kind of fake out his wife. So he's hiding this information from his wife. So it's something that he doesn't want his wife to know. Well, the police could have easily interviewed him. That would be one of the steps. And so, yes, we don't have any record of it, but it doesn't say it didn't happen. But it's like, to me, that's a logical step to take. So they're just saying that the police were so egotistical to say, John, Neal was the first to see it, that they wanted to ignore evidence and ignore the search for Jack the Ripper when that guy could be Jack the Ripper. So let's check on there. Now, I do know one thing is when you look at when Charles Cross was interviewed on September 3rd, Monday, that morning, when his first interview, you could see that they did not think he was a suspect. You could see that when they were asking questions, they were asking all the questions they were asking. Oh, I know one of the things what happened is that they asked him, did you ever meet up with PC Neal? And he says, no, I never. The first person we saw was that guy that was doing knocking up duty, which was PC Meisen. Never met PC John Neal. And also they asked, did you see any blood? And both Robert Paul and Charles Cross said, no, it was too dark. So all they saw was the body laying there. And so then they left. It was PC John Neal that had his lantern that saw the blood flow. And the reason why they asked that is because there was a report on Saturday by the Star, and the Star said that two men saw the body. One left, collected PC Neal, got PC Neal, and they first said both these men saw the blood stains, blood all over the place, and that one of the men stayed and the other men got PC Neal. That was on Saturday. So you can see, so they're saying that, so it wasn't just the Lloyd's Weekly reporter that heard that there's this comment about that shows that they knew about the Carmen on Saturday. Well, my argument is they easily could have corroborated that story by talking to PC Neal on Saturday saying, did anybody come to you? And he would have said, no, it was me. I was on my beat and I saw it. So they would have rejected that story outright because there was no Neal. So now on that Monday morning, they're asking Charles Cross, did you see Neal? And he's saying no. Well, that corroborates the fact that whoever that report from the Star came from got it wrong. And so they just ignored that. And so you can see why they completely ignored that story and why. And so my thought is that when Robert Paul was going back home that night on August 31st, and that he had to go through Bucks Road and he saw that Lloyd's Weekly reporter, there were other reporters around and someone probably heard some of that story. And so they reported that and they just got it mixed up with thinking, okay, they probably thought it themselves. They must have found PC Neal. So it must have been PC Neal, the blood stain, but there was, and again, both Robert Paul and Charles Cross said, we didn't see any blood. It was too dark.
Again, I'm gonna ask about the evidence. Do you think the evidence is strong enough against Cross, or do you think it just fails? That's why the police never used him as a suspect. I mean, again, people that would listen to this, like the main theories and brains that watch true crime or whatever, would just connect. He's at the scene of the crime. He's over the body. When the police arrived, that's a suspect. That's a person. That's probably our guy. And again, you can't really do that because we don't know the whole context, the background, if he would have just actually stumbled across it or if he was even there in the first place.
Yeah. So what I think there's two things. One is I think once the police knew that there were these Carmen that were there at the crime scene before PC Neal, and that was Sunday morning when they saw the Lloyd's Weekly article when Robert Paul says, "Hey, we were the two," and then Robert Paul was the guy that said, "Yeah, the police just fetched me right in the middle of the night." Well, he's verifying that the police were now interested in him and that they wanted to get to the bottom of the story because that very well could be Jack the Ripper. And but by Monday morning, they were convinced. Especially once they needed Misen and they needed Robert Paul to find this guy Charles Cross. And I'm convinced what they did is they did an all-out search that Monday morning at the Pickford and all this to find out who this guy is, where he is, and they found him, and they brought him to that coroner's inquest in his work clothes, and they were basically convinced at that time he was not because I mean, just read it. The police, even the coroners, they were not asking questions about him. They were asking a lot of questions to PC Neal when he was showed up, but um, they were interested in what he saw besides that. So I'm convinced that the police did their job once they found out that there were some people that were at the body after the murder and before PC Neal. So it was right around the time they have to investigate, and they did, and that's what Paul said. But they found out they were convinced that Charles Cross was not involved, and that was by Monday morning, and that's why we don't hear about him anymore at all. Now, to believe in the Lechmere theory, you have to believe that Charles Cross put it upon himself to read that paper Sunday, to go to the coroner's inquest on his own, to say his story, fake it out, and he wore that clothes to fake his wife out, and that worked. And then so because we don't hear about Charles Cross anymore after that. So to me, when we think of we call it Occam's razor in science, where usually the most simplified basic answer is usually the correct one. These convoluted ones are usually not always, but in the case. But to me, it's a simple case of Charles Cross was in a way at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was just walking to work, said he was a little late because he left at 3:30. And of course, they went to Pickford and said, "Does he work here?" I mean, detectives would ask them, who is this guy? Does he work here? How is he a job? They would get details on him. They say that, yes, he does work at 4 o'clock, and that's where they were going. Robert Paul had to get to work at 4 too and had to go through there. So they were just there and they saw it. And I think what happened was, as I said, that here's Jack the Ripper. No one before, and it doesn't matter what theory you think of, nobody saw Polly Nichols with anyone hour before that, anytime before that. And that's what Jack the Ripper, that's him at his MO. And then went in there and her throat was completely, and then there was this long gash here. And that's when he heard Robert or Charles Cross walking towards him. So he sneaked out. There's a bunch of different ways, and it was dark. So he could have just walked towards Charles Cross and walked away. Charles Cross had no idea that there was a dead body there. So this guy could have just walked away, and that would have set off zero alarms. And so there's this alley they call it Piss Alley that he probably went through, or he could have, walked anyway, left. And then here's Charles Cross seeing this tarp. That's interesting to him because, they're poor, so a tarp would be good. So I just see that it was an interrupted case because the next week, that Annie Chapman was identical. Throat cut, then the deep cut, and then the uterus was taken. And then so you could say, I think if those Carmen weren't there within 5 or 10 minutes, it would have been Polly Nichols had her uterus taken out. So I can see an interruption at that time. But But they walked in, and that's kind of what happened. So that kind of starts the whole story. Again, it's still important to have people work that theory. It's just that's not for me.
I get the complexity. Like I said, the JFK stuff. You might not think it's similar, but once you start looking into it and you realize that with the theories and the communities, it's almost identical. Maybe ours is a little bit more aggressive because it's having to do a lot with politics rather than just like a actual historical thing. Um, I think when you examine the varying theories, like the whole royal family did it and all that, it's what people are going to go after because it's the more trendy, kind of dramatic, very complex story that goes with it, that there's like an evil cabal of families that's hiding a giant scandal of a family member, whichever prince or royal that's involved in the Jack the Ripper suspect list or whatever, they get tossed out. But one for the Charles Lechmere one, like I said, it's one of the popular ones. So is the Cosminsky one, and then it's Tumblety. It's usually those three that I see a balance with. Now we've explained Tumblety, we've talked a little bit about Charles Cross, but if he was taking organs, wouldn't that be a problem if his brought it home to his wife
I would think so. And actually, they're saying that he killed these women before work. He was bringing those organs to work,
in a lunchbox?
right? Yeah. So that what they're trying to say is he was a carman for let's say a butching, let's say organ company or company that there's blood around. So it wouldn't be a surprise that he would have blood. Well, they don't know that. They don't know that at all.
Well,
That's
it'd be
not.
suspicious if you got stopped with organs on you or if you had it at work. I mean, Tumblety has an excuse because he's kind of a quack doctor. So, it wouldn't be weird if he had like a couple things hanging in jars that were for remedies or cures or some type of thing.
Well, as a matter of fact, with the Tumbley case is that even though the very first time report we have of Tumbley have been arrested on suspicion was from the New York World London correspondent E. Tracy Greaves in November 17th. Well, the another New York paper that had an article out at the very same time talked about him being arrested because he had these uterus collection. Well, that predates the uterus stories in America talking about Tumbley having a uterus collection, which he did have a uterus collection during the Civil War. But something in that file not only said he had a bitter hatred of women, but very well could have, when they found out where he was at, he might have had that collection there. I mean, they talk about a uterus collection of uteruses. And then, and that is a source from London. The people in London had no idea what was going on in America. I mean, and it just takes a lot of times to figure out the details of Tumblety in America. So it's only in London and that file did they know about Tumblety, and they took him seriously once they read that file. And that's what Chief Inspector Littlechild said, that he had a large file, and we know that he was arrested. That was 1888, were the year of the murders, but 1873 to 1888 is he would usually go to London once a year. Now, the reason why he was going to London was actually way back in the Civil War time. They took the U.S. military army took he claims $1 million from him. He wanted that money back, and he claimed to be a British subject, which he was because he was born in Ireland. So he's trying to get the British government to help him get his money back from the U.S. government. So he was going, and we have reports of him going to the British government in the mid to late 70s, 1870s. Didn't work, but then he kept on coming to London. It was probably the perfect place. He loved cities. Each night, a couple different unsworn testimony, a couple people, even a judge said that Tumblety at night would walk the streets at night, and he would look for the darkest areas where he'd walk. So it was kind of a strange habit to walk at night. All these cities, but and London would be the best of the cities to do that, and he would be here. Now, interestingly, the year before, when he came to London and left London, we had know those two times because he took the SS steamship Rome, and so we know when he did that. Well, this time, 1888, he stayed longer, and so why did he stay longer? That's the kind of an interesting case. And I told you about the murder, that Ripper Lake murder in May of 1888 in New York City, when Tumbley was known to have been on Broad Street, which is a block over here, around that same time. So then he's not leaving. Usually they would leave, come back to America before the winter storms hit because the travel across the North Atlantic sucked. So they would come back earlier, but he was staying and he wanted to stay longer than November. So he was staying longer than usual. So that's why I always, to me, it's intriguing where here Colonel Charles Dunham said that Tumblety had, when he visited, when he did an illustrated lecture, Tumblety had 8 cots, 8 of everything. And he said that Tumblety's favorite number was 8. So what do you know? Polly Nichols was murdered in the 8th month on the year 1888. So it's like, well, another coincidence. But
Does Charles Cross have any issues with photographic evidence of just him? At least like a profile picture. We have Tumblety. We were mentioning off air, but there's another version we talked about last episode. Maybe you can explain a little bit about Tumblety and the kind of confusion with the photograph of what Tumblety actually looks like, and then we can maybe talk about, because I've seen Charles Cross's. He looks like an old guy, like a huge beard. Looks like he looked like he'd be living in a lighthouse. If that's is that accurate, or is that just something that was inserted that could be fake?
well, with Tumblety, they always on his 1871 autobiography, there's a photograph that they found, and it was him, and it's the iconic picture of Tumblety wearing his Prussian helmet. Well, that's not him. He used a double, and how we know that is because, and I think I know who that double is, Mark A. Blackburn, because that was the young man that he would have Blackburn wear his clothes. So Tumblety would wear 4 or 5 suits a day at the time, not not in the 1880s, but back in the 1870s. And then he would have his carman or his driver wear his previous suit. So that guy had to have been the same height. And so here's this young man. You can see that picture, 1871, Tumbley would have been 41 years old, and that's of a younger man than that. And so, but we have a photograph that's Neil Story, historian Neil Story, found in Sir Henry Hall Caine's archives, who was the boyfriend of Tumbley in the 1870s. And there was a picture of Hall Caine and then a separate picture of Tumblety. And how we know it's Tumblety is because written in Hall Caine's handwriting is Francis Tumblety is on the back of that, and it's a different person. And that picture's on the internet too. And that I got permission to use that picture by Neil's Story, and that's the one that people see on the internet is the one that I took from Neil. But that person is, and so it's a different one. But people, even when I see some other books that just came out on Tumblety having that iconic picture, and I said, why don't you listen? That I already told, show that that was not him. Now with the Lechmere one, I don't know the details about that one. I think they might have found a picture, but I don't know that about him. And then, but they do not have a picture of Kosminski, although they do fake some stuff. And some of the pictures you see of Jack the Ripper, one looked like
He has a top hat or has like a giant mustache, and that's like kind of a added version for reporting and all that with the top hat and all that.
right. And then they also have pictures of a man. They apparently looked at all the different eyewitness testimonies and they did a composite. And if you ever watched the show with H.H. Holmes, with Jeff Mudgett trying to say that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper, they made a composite that looked very similar to H.H. Holmes. But here's the problem: nobody saw the murderer. And that's what even Chief Constable McNaughton said. Nobody saw the murder. Nobody saw the murderer. And so that's the issue I have with the Kosminski theory. But so there is no composite. And then of those near eyewitness people, nobody had a good look at the guy. And then when the images that they have are different. One said he looked like this, one said he looked like that. So now they're making a composite picture of near eyewitnesses, which are likely not Jack the Ripper anyway. Now we have a picture that looks like the Queen. Who's that singer for Queen?
Oh, Freddie Mercury?
Yeah, it looks like Freddie Mercury. I said, well, no, I can't be him.
I think it makes it more appealing to have a suspect that has a photo that's a lot newer like that, like Charles Cross has, like Lechmere has, and like Aaron Kosminski has. Because if you notice, Aaron Kosminski also has an issue with his photograph as well too. There's like two people in the one. There's the famous, or the one that everyone references, which is the main photo. Looks like a kid, but there's two people in that main photograph. The father looks a lot like Aaron Kosminski as well too, and he's got a giant mustache and actual top hat onto him. So I can't tell if those are real either. But the three main suspects, the main ones, all have newer photographs like that. Where I go, anyone that's getting interested in the case is going to choose that over a sketch or a poster drawing that was done in like the 1800s. So again, that's where I'm noticing like a similarity with all three of them, why they're all so popular and so trendy. It's like with the Prince family. Google that one. You find all whole listing of them like in the woods taking family photographs or royal family and the one
Yeah.
standing all.
Right.
It's going to get harder with AI coming in, but I've noticed this like when mysterious cases, it seems like the most attractive ones or the most appealing ones where people actually dive in and do a lot of research and do uncover stuff happens to be with newer things that they don't have they can look at rather than dealing with older magazine clippings. Again, you will search the old magazines, but if you have a photo of the guy and he's brand new, like it looks like a newer photograph rather than just a sketch of a dude with a trench coat on with only his eyes showing, it adds a little bit more to it.
Yeah. Right. Yes, and then but even with the Kosminski, the Kosminski one happened in the 1980s, 100-year anniversary, where his name, it was at the time where the big royal conspiracy was going on. So that was the big story of Jack the Ripper was, it could have been the grandson of the Queen and Prince Eddie. But that was debunked pretty fast. But at the time, what happened was the Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson, who was in charge of running the Whitechapel investigation with Scotland Yard, not the City of London, but Scotland Yard. He, at the time, we know for sure, was not convinced of anybody. He was actually convinced that nobody saw the murderer. But about 5, 6 years later, he started hinting at something. And then in his autobiography, he talked about almost saving face because he was in charge, and he's telling people that, oh yeah, we knew, it was an ascertained fact that we know who the killer was. That what happened is that there was a man, a fellow Jew, that we had do an eyewitness testimony, looked at him, ID'd him, but then refused to testify because they did not believe in Gentile law because they were Jewish. And so we already knew who the guy was, and he's in a um, a an asylum, insane asylum. So that person, and then what happened is that autobiography that they looked at, Chief Inspector Swanson, who was also in charge of the murders, his copy on the marginalia they call it, said, and that suspect was Kosminski, just Kosminski, and so that's where the term Kosminski almost came from. The first time we heard of Kosminski is when Chief Constable Melvin McNaughton, 1894, said that there was a suspect that the papers were talking about that could be Jack the Ripper, and he thought that was ridiculous. So he wrote an internal memo saying these three others were more likely of a suspect than them, and then one of them was Druitt, the one that he was convinced was the killer. But he also talked about Kosminski, the Polish Jew theory, and that but McNaughton discounted that and was completely convinced it was Druitt. Well, so then what happened was that where that story comes from is that during the Mitre Square murder, which was not Scotland Yard, by the way, not in the jurisdiction of the Assistant Commissioner Anderson, but it was in the City of London. In Mitre Square, remember, it was PC Watkins that was on the beat there, went in at 1:30, saw nothing. And then these were 15-minute beats, but he said at 1:44, he went back into Mitre Square and he saw the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes. So the thing is that on this side, the street, Duke Street is on this side, on one side of Mitre Square, and it's connected to Mitre Square through this church passage. And so 1:30, the PC Watkins saw nothing. 1:44 saw the mutilated body. Well, these three Jewish men came from a bar on Duke Street at around 1:30 and started walking towards Aldgate High Street. And three of them saw a man and a prostitute, an unfortunate, at that corner of Duke Street and that church passage right there. And you could see that was a man and a prostitute. And one of the guys that had the best look, his name was Lavendi, Joseph Lavendi. So they're saying that. So Lavendi at the coroner's inquest said that, yeah, he didn't get a good look at the guy. That's what he said. And even at the coroner's inquest, they said, well, if he was in front of you again, would you recognize me? He said, no. Well, 2 years later, after the Coles murder, Chief Inspector Swanson and McNaughton used him to try to identify this one person to see if that person was the suspect, Sadler. And it didn't work. But that February 1891, that was the time where they used him again to identify supposed Kosminski. It was February 1891, 2 years later, not in a lineup, just face to face. And so my point is this, is that Duke Street, at 135, they said they saw that couple and they walked by. They did not see that couple go into church passage at all. And so 140, that was the beat of PC Harvey. PC Harvey at 140 saw nobody there. Went into church passage, looked inside Binder Square, saw nothing. It was too dark, and then left. Well, Duke Street was the beat of PC Harvey. So here's PC Watkins. He was ordered to do his beat backwards because people watch your beat. So they sometimes tell him, do your beat backwards. And so what happened is there was a police report that a police officer stated that they thought they saw Catherine Eddowes just before the murder on Aldgate High Street. And that would make sense because there was a report that when PC Watkins was walking Aldgate High Street, then went down Mitre Street into Mitre Square, that couple was watching PC Watkins leave Mitre Square. So they went into Mitre Square. They knew they had 15 minutes. So here's an experienced prostitute, and Jack the Ripper was all about elusive, not getting caught, would watch the people on that beat. Well, they're trying to say that this person on Duke Street with this unfortunate said, hey, let's go into Mitre Square, a different police officer's beat, and do our business. Well, Jack the Ripper's business was to kill. Jack the Ripper would go into a different person's beat. He had no idea where PC Watkins was in his beat because he was over here. So nobody talks about that. It's like, if, so it makes sense that this elusive person would have been on Aldgate High Street with Catherine Eddowes, watch PC Watkins go in there at 1:30. He leaves, then they go in. And by 1:40, he's got this woman mutilated. And what's interesting is that PC Harvey came into Mitre Square. You can see it's a direct line where that murder site was. Jack the Ripper would have saw a police officer coming into Mitre Square from past Church Passage. At 1:40, he would have left. It was 1:44 when PC Watkins saw the mutilated body. So it all matched because there was a third exit, that exit that he would have taken. And along that third exit is where they found that April. It's pretty clear that he took off on that exit. So this right here to me matches. It doesn't matter about Tumblety, it doesn't matter about anything. It's like, I don't see this elusive killer picking up a prostitute on this person's beat, going into a different person's beat to kill, and not knowing where that police officer was on his beat. Or he did. And even there was a police report that said they did. But you don't see that because that doesn't fit the story of Lavendi. So now in books, they all talk about these three people all the time, which is appropriate. But nobody hears us about the story of the police officer seeing that what they thought Eddowes way over here, which would have watched that beat. I'm saying that should be equal time because that right there to me makes more sense. And which is why nobody know who Jack the Ripper was, because he was watching the police officer's beat. As a matter of fact, we go back to the first killing and the killing with Polly Nichols. The report said, PC John Neal went into Bucks Row at 3:15, and then it said, he was clearly being watched by the killer, which is, of course, exactly what would have happened way back then. So they knew that prostitutes would watch the beats of police officers, so they had more time to do their business. Not always, but that you could see that, especially this guy that has a knife on him, and then does not want to get caught. And then so that's my point with the Cosminsky one. I think it's wrong from the start, and there's more to the story of when Assistant Commissioner Anderson became convinced. So what's funny is that here it is, Chief Constable McNaughton was convinced of Druitt. Assistant Commissioner Anderson was convinced of Kosminski, and they had a mutual friend, Major Arthur Griffith. Arthur Griffith, 1895, was the first person that said Assistant Commissioner Anderson has a Polish Jew theory. It's a pretty good one. But what did Major Arthur Griffith be convinced of? McNaughton's. He heard from the horse's mouth Anderson's story, but he didn't take Anderson's story. He took McNaughton's story. So for some reason, McNaughton was more convincing than Anderson with Major Arthur Griffiths, but you don't hear that either. So
Do you think it could have been something personal, like they would have maybe had a better communication or something like that, that he could choose his over the other? Might be
how
speculation, but
could you repeat that? I didn't hear you. Now I can hear you.
just choosing McNaughton over the other guy, do you think it could have been just something personal? Like maybe he just knew him a little bit better, went with it a little bit better.
He was close friends with both.
Okay.
And you have stories of him, and it was not like he says, "I don't believe in Anderson." It's just later on, he just talked more about the Kosminski thing, and that's we hear more about that. And then, so I don't think he had anything against anybody. I mean, even Anderson was always close friends with him. They were always close friends.
Can I ask about the shawl? We talk about the shawl a little
Yeah,
bit.
right. Oh yeah. So the shawl, the now in this case, we're back to Catherine Eddowes because what the story goes that PCA Amos Simpson was a police constable on the scene. He was the first on the scene of the Catherine Eddowes murder, saw this shawl, knew it was going to be a world famous murder, so he pocketed that shawl, kept it in the family. So then years later, the coincidentally, 1988, the 100-year anniversary of Jack the Ripper, we find out that the great great grandnephew of PCA Amos Simpson has this, and he gave part of the shawl to these two ripperologists, and they did some testing, and they couldn't find any DNA on it at all. So then eventually by I think in 1977 is that, the great great grandnephew gave that shawl to the Scotland Yard Museum. So the Scotland Yard Museum just kind of buried the shawl until they found out that he just kind of buried the shawl. And he sold that shawl to Russell Edwards in it was in 1997 for £6,000. So then what happened was is Russell Edwards, he had now it was tested twice. It was on a Australian show, and they found nothing on that shawl. But then he got Dr. Lowell to test it and claimed that he found and this was the report that he found a blood stain and a semen stain. The blood stain clearly was from Catherine Eddowes, so they found a descendant of Catherine Eddowes, and they matched the DNA, mitochondrial DNA, with that blood stain with Catherine Eddowes' descendant. And the semen stain, they matched it with a descendant of Cosminsky on the mother's side. That's mitochondrial DNA follows the mother's mother. Therefore, that shawl that shows that Cosminsky was Jack the Ripper. So the problem, which we found out years ago, at least 4 years ago, is because his first edition of the book talked about that Lowell found the mutation marker 3.141C, and that 314.1C, and that one right there is extremely rare. The descendant of Catherine Eddowes had it, and that was on that shawl. That almost means it's a close match. But it was a mistaken nomenclature. The actual marker was 315.1C. That's on 99% of Europeans have that. So it's no match. They haven't said anything about that. They just buried the story. They no longer put it in the book. And on the other side, here's Dr. Turi King, who is the foremost expert on forensics science. She did the Richard III DNA testing. So she said that, here's Dr. Lowell supposedly they published that article in a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Forensic Science. And she said, strange thing is they hid the data. But the data that they did have, there's two marker differences on that semen stain, which means that is not a match because mitochondrial DNA does not mutate very fast, nor does Y chromosome because it's not part of the rest of the chromosomes. And so two marker difference means it's not a match, and they're saying it's a match. And so, but then what I was telling you before also was that they put this in the Journal of Forensic Science, and they hid the data from the experts. And Dr. Turi King was saying, well, the purpose of peer review is for the peer experts to look at the data, to analyze it themselves to see if you missed anything. It's part of the system. Well, they hid the data from the experts. And so So then they yelled at the Journal of Forensic Science saying, "Why did you even put this in here?" Because Dr. Turi King is one of the referees of that. So what happens is before an article even goes in, the journal will give it to 4 or 5 experts, referees, to say, does this fit? What they're doing is they're trying to get, if there's any opinions in there, it can't be accepted. The evidence has to follow, from the conclude, to the conclusion. And then, so it's the experts to find out if they used all the evidence. So then the journal and the experts went back to Dr. Turi King and Dr. Llewellyn and said, "Well, hey, okay, let's just put the evidence, put the data in." And he lost the data. Lost the data. Okay, so he lost the data. How coincident? How convenient that he lost the data, but you don't hear about this. And then so it really does not match. And then the other problem is that PC Amos Simpson was a Scotland Yard police constable. Catherine Eddowes was murdered in the city of London. They would not allow a police constable from Scotland Yard to be anywhere near it. As a matter of fact, he was working 14 miles to the north. That was what his division was, 14 miles to the north. And so he would not have been there. And also remember, at 1:30, PC Watkins went into Mitre Square, saw nothing. At 1:44, that fast, saw the mutilated body. And so there was no time. The first person to see that was PC Watkins. And then he sounded the alarm. So then within minutes, everybody was there. So when did he grab that shawl? There would be no time. And then what happened is the forensic artist drew that body there, and there is no shawl, and there's an itemized list. There's no shawl on the list. Well, so then Russell Edwards says, "Well, no, no, no. What happened was the reporter was the one that drew the body and wrote the list, wasn't the police, and that reporter mistaken the shawl for her dress that had this floral look called the Michaelmas daisies look, and the shawl has Michaelmas daisies. That's what happened. Well, when you look at the report, no, no, no. They did the itemized list when the body was at the mortuary with the police. That's when they did the list, and it was the police officers. And these reports say that the police say so. It wasn't the case. Russell Edwards is wrong there. And so then the other thing is that on that shawl, the blue dye is water soluble. It would streak if it would rained. And now here's Catherine Eddowes. That morning was doing hot picking with her boyfriend and made no money, came back. She sold that boyfriend's shoes to buy drink. So she had no money, so she sold the boy's shoes. If she had this silk shawl, I think that would be the first thing she would sell.
Hey, don't hate the player, hate the game, my friend.
So then what happens is when you look at the reports, the reason why those three Jewish men didn't leave until 1:30 is because there was a downpour of rain. It was a rainy evening. And so during the murder, it was raining. So you look at the photographs, because Russell Edwards has a photograph of the shawl, and it's likely just a table runner, 2 foot by 8 foot. And so there are no streaks on that. And then check out Michaelmas daisies. You look at those look like poppies. And then, so they don't look like Michaelmas daisies; they look like poppies. So there's just so much wrong with it. Yet none of that's in the story. I mean, it's like the provenance of the shawl. It's just messed up. And Llewellyn told the experts the reason why he assumed that blood stain was a blood stain and that stain was a semen stain is because Russell Edwards told him that shawl was found on her body. That's why. It's not that he found out that was blood and that was semen. There was no identification of blood or semen. He assumed it just because it was on that body. And that's what the experts report, what Llewellyn had said. But you don't find that in his book or in the newspaper articles. So it was debunked 4 years ago, and it's just that his third edition just came out. And this businessman does have some connections, because next thing you know, it's in the papers. And just like what you said, it sounds good. Oh, they have DNA evidence of who the killer was. And to me, they're using a suspect that the only reason why he's a suspect is because that eyewitness 2 years later, they're claiming that saw this person that was clearly Jack the Ripper, when that suspect didn't even see that person go in to Mitre Square. And he told the coroners, at the coroner's inquest that if he saw the guy again, he wouldn't recognize him. 2 years later, and it wasn't a lineup either. You'd usually use a lineup. Which one is he? No, it was face to face. And so I think what happened is here's Assistant Commissioner Anderson years later. This is the only case, the world famous case that he's kind of embarrassed about because he was in charge and they never got the killer. So he's now saying, "Oh yeah, they certainly did. It's ascertained fact." And then it's just that Jewish man would not go to court and because they didn't believe in Gentile law. Well, I think what happened was they certainly did use that, did have him. I know that because Chief Inspector Watson that same month, February 1891, used the Lavendi in the Sadler case, Cole Sadler case, and it was that 2 weeks later is when Aaron Kosminski was put in that Colney Hatch asylum. So their report said that they did this ID just before he was put in the asylum. So it was at that time they were using Swanson was using that person, which we know was the man on Duke Street, which was Lavendi, and did that. So I know they did it, but I think now Anderson wasn't there. Anderson always said that he would read the reports. It was Swanson that convinced Anderson, but McNaughton was there too. But McNaughton wasn't convinced, but Swanson was. But so somehow he's trying to say that Jewish man that spoke Jewish, Hebrew, did not speak English. And you're claiming that he said that is the guy. I'm just not going to say it. And by the way, Chief Inspector Swanson, Assistant Commissioner Anderson were not involved with that directly because they were part of Scotland Yard. That was City of London was involved with the Catherine Eddowes murder. So I think there's cracks in there. And Martin Fido, the man that really pushed for he was the one that found Aaron Kosminski in the Colney Hatch records. He was not so convinced himself after a while because he was still believed in the Polish Jew thing, but he knew that there were problems with Aaron Kosminski. So that's where the term Nathan Kosminski comes from, and then another name which is I forgot the name, but that he thought was Jack the Ripper. To me, is that the guy didn't even eyewitness this person murdering the person, and I'm just saying that they were on another beat anyway. I'm still saying that other police officer really did see Catherine Eddowes on Aldgate High Street just before the murders. So that's to me, that's so much for the DNA evidence.
We did a great job at talking about some of the things we want to talk about, which was the other suspects. Like I said, there was the primary three that I keep coming across was Tumblety, Lechmere, and then Cosminsky. I do appreciate the time, Mr. Hawley, for you giving me the time to be able to speak on my show again. And you remember a lot. Like, you're very good at specific details, and you really, I would say anybody listening would take away from, and I'm going to ask you honestly what you should recommend to anybody out there listening that'll be looking into the case. But for me, for the JFK stuff, I'm like you, I like with the opinions and theories. I'm just trying to look at the evidence and stuff. And it's critical thinking out of all of it. I mean, yeah, people are entitled to their own opinions and their own theories and all these types of things, but I think everything should just be stated as, in my opinion, it's this. Everyone's got their own specific research. They got everyone's entitled to their opinions. But again, there is so much out there where you do find a lot of things are connected where you wouldn't think they were connected. Now, people can do that speculation. But again, it just really calls us to have an open mind, have these discussions. I'm hoping to go to a Jack the Ripper conference just to be able to see how everybody's brain works, because the JFK conferences are not as pleasant if you're going there. Maybe because it's intertwined with politics a little bit, but it's crazy how so many people can be obsessed or just interested in one event and then come out with different outcomes or different ideas or different thought processes on how things work. And I love the way your mind works on a lot of this stuff. I think you've documented in the first episode we did, and then also in this episode, a lot of reasoning and specific things that would, I think, cause anybody to at least question more or just want to look at it again and be like, okay, maybe I should look at it through this angle. But would you recommend anything out there to anybody listening that would be interested in?
I do. I would recommend first what you're talking about, your frame of mind. Even with my stuff, is you have to be skeptical. And if there's a person saying case closed, be even more skeptical, because there's more to the story. And this story really, sadly, in certain ways, does not have an ending. There is not going to be a case where, hey, here's a confession. Well, we put that in with the dozens of other confession letters that we've found already. So it's part of history. But I would say, and that's kind of like the adversarial system of justice in court, where listen to one side, you're going to convince, but wait for the other side, listen to that side too, so you can get both sides of the story. So to me, you need to never be, if you are convinced, okay, now look at the evidence against that. And then and it goes back, and that's, to me, that's fun. That's the fun part. And then because I all these suspects need to be researched, because Jack the Ripper could be one of them, or it could be somebody completely different. So, but to get closer to the truth, you gotta keep on researching, I think.
And where can people find your links, Mr. Hawley?
My hub is usually my website, michaellhawley.com. I put the L in there because some MIT professor stole Michael Hawley. But so michaellhawley.com, and then all the lectures that a lot of the lectures I've filmed that I have some more lectures coming up, but I enjoy that part. But a lot of the podcasts that I've been on, and then so it's all there. And then you can upload any of my articles. Of course, my books are there, but or you can, you can contact me through that way too.
Well, I'll make sure to link all your links in the description below. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.